Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
The funny thing about working as a welder is that some people can't tell the difference between different types of workers in uniforms. I've been working at Smith & Son's steel fabrication for about 3 years by that point, and my buddy and I had developed quite the reputation for our pranks. We weren't malicious, just a couple of guys trying to make the long hours more entertaining. One of our best moves was switching our name tags through some creative paperwork with the uniform company. I became Buzz and he became Sputnik. Our boss thought it was hilarious, especially since we actually got our work done and were good at our jobs. Our shop was right across the alley from this big Canadian retail store. You know, the one with the red triangle logo. They sell everything from kitchen sinks to camping gear, and they've got an auto service center. Their mechanics wear these distinct red and black coveralls, while we wear blue ones with our company's name clearly embroidered on them. One evening, my buddy and I were staying late to work on his car's brakes. We needed a break after wrestling with the rusty bolts, so we stepped out to the alley behind our shop to enjoy some cigars. That's when this woman pulled up in her car, looking at us like we were somehow inconveniencing her by existing. She immediately demanded that we diagnose what was wrong with her car. When my buddy told her we were on break, she insisted that we could still help her. I decided to play along and told her it sounded like her water pump needed a solenoid. She then demanded to know what specific part she needed, so I made up a part number telling her she needed an X34578 water pump solenoid. My buddy joined in on the fun and suggested she'd probably need a rebuild kit for her oil exchanger too. Getting more worked up, she demanded to know when we could start working on her car. My buddy, keeping the joke going, told her to go to the parts counter for the parts and then drop her car at the service center doors. We needed some brake fluid anyway, so we headed into the store. While we were there, we spotted her at the parts counter, getting increasingly frustrated. She was complaining to the parts guy about how some mechanics outside had told her she needed these parts, and she couldn't understand why they weren't in the system. We were trying our best not to burst out laughing while checking out, but as we were leaving, she spotted us and loudly announced to the parts guy that we were the mechanics who had helped her. The parts guy simply told her that we didn't work there. She followed us outside, yelling about how unprofessional we were and repeatedly demanding to know where we worked. We just laughed and walked back to our shop. About 15 minutes later, our boss called us into his office. There she was, standing there with her face as red as those mechanics' coveralls we weren't wearing. When our boss asked what happened, we explained everything exactly as it went down. She then started ranting, demanding that our boss fire both Buzz and Sputnik, claiming we were terrible at our jobs and completely unprofessional. Our boss couldn't contain his laughter at this point, and neither could we. He pointed out the obvious, that we weren't even wearing the red and black coveralls of the store's mechanics, and questioned why she'd even ask us for help in the first place, adding that our name tags alone should have been a clear sign we were just going to mess with her. She stormed out of the office, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. I thought we might be in trouble, but our boss just kept laughing. He knew us well enough by then to know that if someone's going to mistake two welders in blue coveralls for auto mechanics in red ones, they're pretty much asking to be messed with. We still had to finish the brake job on my buddy's car, but that interruption made our evening way more entertaining than we expected. To this day, whenever we see someone storming around in a parking lot, we still joke about water pump solenoids. I've been working at this small cafe in downtown for about 3 years now. It's a cozy little place that attracts all sorts of people, from busy office workers to students and retirees. I started as a part-time barista while studying nursing, but after graduating I decided to keep my morning shifts. There's something peaceful about starting your day making coffee for others, and my manager is understanding about my evening hospital shifts. That peaceful routine was shattered last Tuesday morning. The cafe was bustling as usual, with the typical morning rush of people wanting their caffeine fix before heading to work. I was manning the counter while my co-worker was preparing drinks. A woman I'll call Karen walked in. She was wearing an expensive-looking business suit and had that "I need to speak to your manager" haircut. At first, she seemed normal enough, just another customer getting in line. But then I noticed her glaring at one of our regular customers. This regular customer is a sweet older woman who comes in 3 times a week for her morning coffee. She has a hearing impairment and wears a hearing aid. Usually, she writes down her order on her phone to make communication easier, but that morning her phone had died. I greeted her and asked if she wanted her usual order. She struggled to read my lips due to the morning noise and politely asked me to repeat myself. That's when Karen, who was standing behind her, let out an exaggerated sigh. Karen started complaining loudly about how some people had places to be. When our regular customer tried to explain her hearing impairment and that she was doing her best, Karen just got more aggressive. She told her to try harder and demanded that she speak up and enunciate properly, as if it were a simple thing to do. Our regular customer's face turned red with embarrassment. She attempted to explain her situation again, but Karen interrupted her. She told our regular customer that if she couldn't order properly, she shouldn't be in line at all and suggested she go home and practice speaking like what she called a normal person. My blood was boiling, but I tried to stay professional. I asked Karen to be respectful, explaining that this was a regular customer who was doing her best to communicate. Karen shot back that she didn't care if the woman was the Queen of England, saying she had a meeting in 20 minutes and refused to be late because someone couldn't learn to speak properly. What happened next still makes my stomach turn. Karen reached out and literally snatched the hearing aid from our regular customer's ear. The regular customer cried out in pain and surprise. Karen started yelling about how maybe now she would learn to listen properly. Then she began screaming directly into our regular customer's ear, spittle flying everywhere. The regular customer was crying, covering her ears with her hands. That's when a tall man, who had been waiting in line, stepped forward. He was wearing hospital scrubs. I later found out he was an off-duty security guard from the local hospital. In one smooth motion, he grabbed Karen's wrist, twisted it behind her back, and forced her to the ground. He announced that he was detaining her for assault and asked someone to call the police. I immediately called the police while my co-worker helped our regular customer to a chair and got her some water. Karen kept screaming about police brutality and claiming she was just trying to help, but nobody was buying it. When the police arrived, they took statements from everyone. Karen was arrested and charged with assault and battery. Our regular customer pressed charges, and Karen was later sentenced to community service at a center for people with hearing impairments. She's also permanently banned from our cafe. My manager installed better security cameras after this incident, and we've implemented a system where customers can write their orders on a small whiteboard if they prefer. Our regular customer still comes in 3 times a week, and now she always has a bright smile for us. I've spent 8 years working in telecom customer service, starting as a regular agent and working my way up to manager. The promotion was a mixed blessing, better pay, but now I had to deal with the most entitled customers who demanded to speak to a manager. Our department originally handled only business sales, but corporate decided to expand our role to include general service and retention. They threw us into handling billing disputes and cancellation calls with barely any training. That's where this story begins. I had trained my team to handle most customer escalations themselves, since 90% of the time these manager requests were just customers wanting to hear the same thing from a different voice. But this Monday morning, one of my best agents approached my desk with an amused look. When she reached my desk, she told me about an entitled businessman on the line saying I would love this one. She explained that the customer was demanding a refund for a $25 monthly calling pack he claimed he never signed up for. This pack included international calls and mobile numbers, which weren't covered in our standard business plans. She went on to explain that she had tried to tell him he was actually saving money with this pack because of his frequent calls to India and China. but he kept cutting her off. According to her, he had accused them of being unethical and claimed she didn't understand basic math. When I asked if she had tried breaking down the costs for him, she explained that he wouldn't let her finish a single sentence. She said he just kept insisting he knew how it worked and didn't make mobile calls. I took over the call, already plotting my malicious compliance. Before I could even finish my introduction, the businessman started ranting. He complained about not having time for this and accused our company of shady sales practices. He demanded a refund for 4 months of what he called unnecessary charges, totaling $100. I tried to explain the situation, but he kept interrupting, claiming he didn't make mobile calls and accusing us of running a scam to charge extra fees. Every time I attempted to point out his call records, he would cut me off and demand I just process the refund, saying he didn't have time for this. After several more attempts to explain, I finally managed to get through one complete sentence. I said if I refunded the calling pack cost, he would be liable for all calls made to international numbers. He impatiently agreed, telling me to just get on with it. I started to give him his reference number, but he hung up before I could finish. I turned to my agent with the biggest grin and told her to take some time off the phones. I explained that I needed her to calculate every single international call he had made without the calling pack rates. The system didn't automatically calculate backdated charges, so it took some work. But our terms and conditions allowed us to correct billing errors going back 6 months. We credited his account the $100 he demanded, then added charges for every international call at the standard rate plus connection fees. The final bill came to just over $700. I made detailed notes about our conversation, especially the part where he explicitly agreed to pay for all calls at standard rates. A week later, he called back and demanded to speak to another manager. My colleague came to my desk afterward laughing. She told me that our international calls guy had just received his new bill and was absolutely furious. When I asked what she told him, she explained how she had read in my notes about his insistence on the refund and agreement to standard rates. She said that when he tried arguing that he thought international landlines were included in the basic plan, she reminded him of his own words about knowing how it works and his refusal to let us explain. He had to pay every cent. Our terms and conditions were clear, and we had recordings of him cutting off every attempt to explain the charges. Living in a cul-de-sac has its pros and cons. On the bright side, it's perfect for families with young kids, like mine. My wife and I chose this place specifically because we wanted a safe environment for our children to grow up in. Most of our neighbors are wonderful people who look out for each other's kids. We're the kind of community where children can ride their bikes in the street and play outside without constant supervision. But the downside of cul-de-sac life? Everyone knows everyone's business. And sometimes that business involves dealing with someone who thinks they're above common courtesy and basic safety rules. In our case, that someone was a 21-year-old who still lived with his parents 3 houses down from us. Let's just say he wasn't winning any Neighbor of the Year awards. He'd blast music at midnight, throw parties that left beer cans all over other people's lawns, and drive like he was auditioning for Fast and Furious. My wife and I tried to be understanding. We were young once too. But this guy took it to another level. The incident that finally pushed me over the edge happened last summer. My kids, aged 8 and 6, were playing with their chalk on the street, something they'd done hundreds of times before. My wife and I were on the front porch, keeping an eye on them while enjoying our weekend coffee. That's when we heard it, the roar of an engine followed by tires screeching. The kid came tearing around the corner in his souped-up car, going at least 40 miles per hour in our 15-mile-per-hour street. My wife and I both jumped up, our hearts in our throats. The kids were nowhere near his path, thank God, but that wasn't the point. I walked over to his house, my wife right beside me. He was still getting out of his car when we approached. I tried to start a conversation about his dangerous driving habits. He responded dismissively, asking what I was talking about. When I explained about the kids playing and riding bikes in the street and how he couldn't speed like that, he just brushed me off rudely. My wife jumped in. telling him this was our business because he could have hit someone. His only response was to give us both the middle finger before walking into his house. That was it, the last straw. Here's where it gets interesting. My younger brother is a police officer, and his best friend happens to work in our town's department. I'm not usually one to pull strings, but when it comes to my kid's safety, all bets are off. I called the police station, asked for my brother's friend, and explained the situation. He came by about an hour later. When he arrived, he asked what was going on. I explained about the reckless driver and pointed out which house was his. The officer's expression changed immediately upon seeing the house. He commented that they were familiar with that one resident and his attitude toward law enforcement. When I explained that I just wanted him to drive safely, the officer assured me he would look into it and keep an eye on the situation. I figured that would be it. Maybe they'd patrol more often or give him a warning. But it turned out our friendly neighborhood speed demon had some skeletons in his closet. Several unpaid speeding tickets, missed court dates, the works. The police had been looking for an excuse to deal with him, and now they had one. A few days later, I was doing yard work when I saw 2 police cars pull up to his house. What happened next was better than any reality TV show. The cops knocked on the door, and his brother answered. When they asked for the speed demon by name, the brother tried to claim he was the one they were looking for. The officers clarified they wanted his brother, but he kept insisting he was the person they wanted. Now, lying to the police about your identity is a pretty stupid move. The officers knew exactly who they were looking for, and this little stunt just made things worse. They ended up arresting both brothers, one for the unpaid tickets and missed court dates, and the other for lying to the police. When they were being led to the patrol cars, our speed demon started shouting about harassment and claiming he knew his rights. The officer told him he'd had plenty of chances to handle this properly, and now he could explain it to the judge. The parents came home later that day to find both their sons had been arrested. I almost felt bad for them. Almost. The street's been peaceful ever since. He still lives there with his parents, but his car doesn't roar anymore, and he drives like someone who's learned their lesson. I see him slow down to almost a crawl when he passes our house. Guess those tickets and a night in jail were expensive enough to make him think twice about speeding. My brother's friend told me later that they'd been getting complaints about this kid for months, but they needed a solid reason to act. My call was just the final piece they needed to connect all the dots. I never intended for anyone to get arrested. I just wanted our street to be safe for our kids. That's all. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.